Okay, so as promised, here's a video of some of the work I'd like you to look over during our Thursday lesson. And we're going to just delve back into the respiratory system. So prior to your mock exam, before we halted for that, we got about halfway through the function of the respiratory system. And hopefully you can remember that we took a little look at the mechanics or the mechanism of breathing. So we spent some time looking at the processes that help you breathe in for inspiration, and then what happens when you need to breathe out, expiration. And we spent towards the latter part of that lesson just looking at the difference between those processes at rest and then during exercise. And then today, what I want you to kind of focus on using this PowerPoint is what actually happens, what gaseous exchanges. So once we've done this breathing in part, what we actually need to do in terms of exchanging gases and why that's important. So that's the plan. So it's on the back of the PowerPoint that we used, which is also available on at source as well. So if you want to spend some time without the video attachment looking at it later on when you are revising for this, then it will be available there as well. So gaseous exchange, some of you might have some prior knowledge coming from your GCSE or level 2 BTEC sport routes. Some of you perhaps have no idea whatsoever. If you were to bring up an image, so type in and search for what gaseous exchange actually looks like, very commonly it kind of gets depicted by a diagram similar to this, which if you are completely unsure about what gaseous exchange actually involves, it can be quite a daunting diagram to kind of look at. In a nutshell, just to kind of almost kind of point you in the right direction, this part here, so you can see it's largely white and then it's got this blue outline, that's your alveoli sac. So thinking about when we were looking at the structure of the respiratory system, this is your alveoli. So on the end of the bronchioles, you've got your alveoli. I'll just bring up to remind you. So this is our PowerPoint that we used when we were looking at the structure. You've got your bronchioles, and then on the end of those little florets of broccoli, as I like to call them, you have your alveoli. And that's the key site. They may look really small but mighty they are. Okay, so that's your key site for where gaseous exchange actually takes place. Okay, so we'll put back on and have a little look at this diagram. And then surrounding the alveoli, so remember this is inside your lungs, you have blood vessels. And the smallest blood vessels, we'll go on to look at blood vessels in a bit more detail in the next unit, but the smallest blood vessels are your capillaries, and they surround the alveoli. Okay, and it's that perfect surrounding that helps to set up two membranes next to each other, which enables you to have this gaseous exchange process. Okay, and if that diagram's still looking a little bit complex, don't panic, because towards the end of this video I've kind of set up a much kind of more simpler version, which once you've seen it, if you then pop back to this version, you'll perhaps be able to kind of understand it that little bit more. Okay, but yeah, it's the idea, this network of capillaries is going to have within it both oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood. Once you breathe in, the oxygen from the alveoli will diffuse across this membrane from the alveoli into the capillary. Okay, but because it's an exchange process, at the same time as that process occurring, we need the tired blood, so all of this kind of blue looking deoxygenated blood that would have been on a journey around the body, we need that to diffuse back into the alveoli so that the alveoli can then whisk that carbon dioxide through the rest of the respiratory system structure, and eventually it will be breathed out either through the mouth or through your nose. Okay, but more on that diagram a little bit later. Here are the kind of theory points behind it, and I know you've got this in video presentation, but as ever I would definitely recommend sort of jotting down your understanding and your concept of this. But yeah, it's clearly the process by which one type of gas is exchanged for another in the lungs. So in this instance, we're looking at oxygen carbon dioxide exchange. And this key process, and you'll see this in the exam question later, it occurs via diffusion, which is, in a nutshell, the idea of gases moving from a high area of concentration to a low area. So they tend to move down. If you can visualize, follow the cursor here, visualize a downward diagonal line representing the diffusion gradient. And I think I've mentioned before, you can liken it to the idea of lots of passengers on a tube train, particularly in this day and age where we're thinking of social distancing. They will want to move from that jam-packed carriage, so the area of high concentration of people, down the diffusion gradient or down further into the carriages or into the train where there's more space, there's more kind of freedom for them to move around. Okay, and you can set up a diffusion gradient between two places. So in this instance, we've got our structure from the lungs, the alveoli, and next door to those are the capillaries. Okay, so those two walls, thinking back to that complicated diagram you've just seen, those two walls are adjacent, and then the diffusion gradient is set up between them. So oxygen from the lungs will enter the bloodstream, and then at the same time, so remember it's that exchange process, it will remove carbon dioxide from the bloodstream to the lungs. Okay, it needs to kind of occur at the same time because then you've got equal space that's left. Okay, and then further theory behind it. The alveoli and capillary walls, they form what's also known as this respiratory membrane. So there's gas on one side, so gas on the side of the alveoli, and then blood on the other side. So blood is on the other side of the membrane in the capillary. So you're going to get diffusion from the alveoli into the capillary. And then the blood in the capillaries has a lower concentration of oxygen, but it has a higher concentration of carbon dioxide compared to that of the air in the alveoli. Okay, so if you like, the alveoli is lacking carbon dioxide, and the capillaries has a lot of carbon dioxide. Okay, so it's picked up that carbon dioxide from the pulmonary arteries. You'll get more of an understanding of this again when we look at the cardiovascular system. So the oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood. Okay, so there's a greater need for that lovely oxygen in the blood, or to get into the blood, because at the minute the alveoli is jam-packed full of oxygen we've just breathed in. The alveoli can't really contain too much more oxygen, so it needs to travel down that diffusion gradient through these really lovely thin walls, and into the capillaries. Okay, and these thin walls, I have seen some exam questions before that ask, why is this gaseous exchange process allowed to happen? And these are one of the things. It's because of these thin permeable walls, which means that the gases can travel through them really quickly and easily. And then once that oxygen has got into the capillary, it doesn't just hang around there. It's got work to do essentially. So it's going to target our lovely red blood cells. So it will diffuse further into our red blood cell through the membrane of the red blood cell. And then perhaps for some prior knowledge, you might well be aware of the fact that hemoglobins are found within red blood cells. Hemoglobins can carry up to 4 molecules of oxygen. So the oxygen will kind of latch on to the hemoglobin. And then remember, it's not just all about oxygen. Carbon dioxide has a part to play. So the carbon dioxide, at the same time as the oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide will diffuse in the opposite direction. So it will travel out of the blood plasma, that will be in the capillaries, across the capillary membrane, but in the opposite direction, into the alveoli, and then that carbon dioxide will travel all the way through the respiratory system, all of those structures we've learned about in prior lessons to this one, where it gets breathed out, either through your nose or your nasal cavity or your mouth. Okay. And then just to draw your attention, I mentioned previously about the idea of more of a simple diagram. So this pink square represents the alveolar, or alveoli if you're just looking at it, just looking at the one. And then this pink square over here is your capillary. So let's just imagine that I've just breathed in, which then means that all of the alveoli contained within my respiratory system have got a really nice healthy amount of oxygen. You might well be thinking, well, hang about, I can still see some carbon dioxide. There will always be a mixture of gases present, but it's kind of like which gas is top dog in that mix. Okay, so when we've breathed in, we would say that oxygen is kind of going to be the top dog, the overruling gas in the alveoli. Okay, and then next door, so it's not particularly thin, but let's imagine this is our really nice thin respiratory membrane. So right next door to the alveoli, you've got your blood network, your capillaries. Okay, and the capillaries at the minute have within them loads of carbon dioxide. So we've got some tired blood. It's been all the way around the body from your little toe to your head, and it needs to get out of the body basically. So we need to get rid of it, we need to expel it. And once again, in the capillary, there will be one or two, the odd molecule of oxygen still floating around, but in this situation, your carbon dioxide is the top dog, the overruling gas in this mix. Okay, and then there's a kind of visual representation of what occurs. Okay, obviously my animation skills are not showing that this process happens at the same time, but hopefully you're getting into your head just through seeing all of the random crazy circles move across this idea of the exchange process. So now if you look, the alveoli now contains more carbon dioxide, so it's got a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in comparison to the capillary, and then that carbon dioxide is going to work its way out of the respiratory system. We will breathe it out. Okay, and then the capillary, because of this gaseous exchange process, now has a really nice amount of oxygen, so it has a higher concentration of oxygen compared to what you currently find in the alveoli, and also a higher concentration of oxygen in comparison to carbon dioxide. Okay, so loads of oxygen molecules and only a few carbon dioxide molecules. And so this oxygen will then carry about its onward journey, which means, and you can perhaps see represented in this diagram, it would get whisked around the body, around the circulatory system. Okay, but we'll go into that in a little bit more detail when we look at the next unit, which is our cardiovascular system unit. Okay, and then just to kind of look in terms of how gaseous exchange could actually be examined. I've seen mostly 4-mark questions. There is a 6-mark question which we will have a go at some stage once we've spent a bit more time brushing up our extended answer questions. But yeah, just to kind of get to grips with this one. So thinking of our BTEC command words, it's a descriptive question. So we're describing and we're looking at the process, okay? And obviously the main focal point, because I've just spent some time on the video teaching it to you, is gaseous exchange, okay? And then further things to draw about is where are we actually doing this exchange from? Because I have seen questions, and it's an easy way of catching people out if examiners are being mean. I've seen questions where it's actually worded capillary, but obviously the focal point here is alveoli, and then that would be the idea of alveoli. Straight away you should be thinking into the capillary, okay? And then in terms of a bit of exam technique, we're trying to brush up on our skills. It's a process and we're only having to describe, so I would look to think about bullet pointing my responses. Right, and 4 marks total. I would put at least 4 bullet points. If I could think of a 5th, I might put that down. Sometimes the examiner, particularly on a process one where you really have to get the order correct, sometimes there will be a little mark to them, a little subnote that actually says only accept the first 4 points, because then that basically stops students writing lists of 20 points, stabbing in the dark, just kind of guessing. So sometimes you might well come across that. So if it's a process, do try your best to get it down into the correct order, okay? So I'll just spin you through the answers. I know that's a bit back to front, but obviously not in the lesson to give you the time to go through. So the first thing you would pick up a mark for is, because we're looking at the process, the key part of this process is diffusion. So by writing diffusion, you're going to be picking up your first mark, okay? And then you can look here that you're going to get your further 3 marks by describing that process, essentially. And you can see you've got one paragraph here where you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 marks available. Remember, it's a 4-mark total question. And a second paragraph with 4 marks available. These questions are nice because it's providing you can remember the process, you can kind of choose which way you attack it from. I would advise not mixing up the processes, but once you've described one part of the process of diffusion from the alveoli and gaseous exchange, because it's only 4 marks available, you don't then have to describe the other part, okay? So if you want to, you can do it all from the kind of, if you like, the positive point of view, and say that the oxygen in the alveoli is at a high concentration, and then the oxygen in the blood capillaries is at a low concentration, which then results in the oxygen moving from the alveoli into the blood capillaries. Okay, and then that would get you, I know it's easy for me to sort of sit here and say, but that would get you your 4 marks. What you don't then have to do is flip it and write about, just for this question, you don't have to write about the other side. But what I was sort of trying to link about is, if you were struggling to remember, which sometimes happens in the exam, you kind of get a little bit of freeze. If you were struggling to remember what happens when we're talking about oxygen, providing that you start with that key process, so we're thinking about diffusion, just look at it from the opposite point of view. So carbon dioxide in the alveoli starts off as being low, but hang about, the carbon dioxide in the neighbouring capillaries is really high. So you've set up that diffusion gradient, therefore that carbon dioxide is going to move from where it's really busy in the blood capillaries to where it's less busy in terms of carbon dioxide into the alveoli. Okay, just to clarify, what I would avoid just for this question is mixing up the two. Okay, so by that I mean not to begin with saying that oxygen in the alveoli is at a high concentration and then suddenly flipping and then saying that carbon dioxide in the alveoli is low. Keep it on one side if you like, so either describe the oxygen part or describe the carbon dioxide part. Okay, I mentioned before we looked at that question that I have come across an extended answer question. I think it's worth 6 marks. That gets you and wants you to discuss both sides of the story. Okay, but just for this occasion, because it's only describing, it's only worth 4 marks. We're literally just kind of talking about it from one side of the argument, if you like. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense in terms of the gaseous exchange delivery. I will be attaching this video to an email and also sending it out via the chat on Teams, and be giving you another task that I would like you to do alongside it once you've viewed it. Okay, thank you for watching and listening, and I'll catch up with you in our next lesson.